And it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. And the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up to God by reason of the bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. Now what's interesting about this little passage from the 2nd chapter of Exodus, beginning in verse 23, is that everything that follows, that's the whole story of Exodus, is because of this. It's because of the deal God made with Abraham a long time ago. Notice what it says. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his deal he made with Abraham. Remember what it was? It was that he was going to give him the land of Palestine and more for a possession. In fact, everything from the river of Egypt all the way to the great river Euphrates. So what's about to happen is because God was called into memory and remembered that covenant. Everything that follows is about that. This is important because the events of the Exodus and the giving of the law at Mount Sinai don't hang in midair. They aren't just something that came out of nowhere. They came straight out of that old covenant, the oldest of the old covenant. The covenant that we call the old covenant is nothing more than a specific application of the old covenant that God made with Abraham. So you can take note of this. The old covenant, when it was given, was a new covenant at the time. It was a new deal. In Exodus chapter 6, verse 1, begins the story really the story has begun before this, but the story now begins to develop of the old covenant, what we call the old covenant. The Lord said to Moses, "Now see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will actually drive them out of his land." It's a strange thing. He actually drove Israel out, and yet in the end he repented of that and went after them to bring them back. And God spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am Jehovah. I appeared unto Abraham and Isaac and unto Jacob by the name of God Almighty, but by my name Jehovah I was not known to them. And I have established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, wherein they were strangers." Now if you'll notice, this is all past tense. He said, "I have also," it's already done, "established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, the land where they were strangers. And," verse 5, "I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians kept in bondage. I have remembered my covenant." So he cut the deal with Abraham, and if you recall, he said that your seed will go into Egypt, they'll be there for a long time, and then come back because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So, time had to pass. Generations had to pass. And now at long last, a new Pharaoh has come up. A new Pharaoh is really oppressing these people, and their cry and their groaning has come up to God. "Wherefore I say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out of the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rid you of their bondage. I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments. And I'll take you to me for a people, and I will be to you for a God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, which brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land concerning which I did swear to give it to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to you for a heritage." So you've got an ongoing relationship that was established with Abraham. And remember, one of the things we talked about on covenants is that what a covenant does is to establish a new relationship, a new disposition of things. It is more than a contract. It's more than an agreement. It's a relationship. And Moses then spoke so to the children of Israel. We're in Egypt now. And I think one of the saddest things I've ever read is this statement that follows. It said, "But they hearkened not to Moses for anguish of spirit and for cruel bondage." These people were whipped, and they were incapable of independent action. I mean, you could have gone down there, you could have tried to get a bunch of them together and organize them, and the chances are, as many of them as there were, you could have organized a pretty good army of them and probably fought your way out of Egypt. But they were whipped. They didn't have the will to fight. They didn't have the ability to do anything. So the entire Exodus story, then, is a direct result and a continuation of, fulfillment of, if you will, of a much earlier covenant. Coming now down to Exodus the 19th chapter, verse 1. They're out of Egypt. They're on their way to the promised land. In the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone out of the land of Egypt, the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. For they departed from Rephidim, and they came to the desert of Sinai and pitched in the wilderness, and there they camped before the mount. And Moses went up unto God, and the Lord called him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You saw what I did to the Egyptians. You saw how I bore you out of there on eagle's wings, which is just simply another way of saying I brought you out miraculously. I brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Now I don't know what the Israelites thought when they heard these words, or what Moses thought when he heard God speak these words. Because what he says, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, no covenant had been made at this point except the one with Abraham. The one that he said, God remembered the covenant. Because I remembered the covenant, because of my word to Abraham, I'm bringing you out of bondage, and I am going to give you this land. If you do this, you'll be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, and these are the words which you will speak to the children of Israel. Now, what follows in this section here in Exodus, and I'd like to just take a look at it from chapter 20 on, are some revelations of laws that God gave to Israel, and they're curious in a way. The first thing you get, beginning in chapter 20, is the Lord spoke all these words, saying, and then follows the Ten Commandments, with which we are all very familiar. They are all outlined here. We all know then that when the Ten Commandments were given, the people were frightened to death because of the voice coming down off the mountain. God spoke these words out loud. They could hear them, they could understand them, and it frightened them, as the mountain was on the smoke and there's giant earthquakes because there was so much power in the area at this time. So they said to Moses, You speak to God and we'll listen. Don't let God speak to us, or else we will die. Then in chapter 21 begins a set of, what it says is, these are the judgments which you shall set before them. Now, a judgment is a class of law. Generally speaking, a judgment comes along when there is a question of law that has been raised. Is this a violation of that law? Or whose property is this? Was damage done to this man, and so forth, in what amount? You weigh the evidence, and then you arrive at a judgment. Now, in this case, he seems to be dealing with, and many of them do seem to fall in the category of a judgment, where there is a question. What do we do about this? Here's what you do about this. And they have to do with applications in that society at that time, in that place. In chapter 21, it begins with laws having to do with slavery. It goes on later in the chapter, in verse 13, to deal with manslaughter. Verse 16, with kidnapping. On over into verse 17, he that curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. Law after law after law. In chapter 22, you have theft, damage, trespass, borrowing, fornication, witchcraft, bestiality, idolatry, how you treat strangers in the land, and so forth. In chapter 23, you have laws of slander, false witness, charitableness, the year of the rest, about the Sabbath, about idolatry, of the three general feasts in the land, of the sacrifice, and an angel is promised to be with them through the whole thing. Now, what's interesting about this long segment through here is that this is what comes to be called the Book of the Covenant. It's a technical term. It applies specifically to these things. Now, it tells us in Exodus 24, verse 4, that Moses wrote all the words of the Lord and rose up early in the morning and built an altar under the hill with 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Notice, he wrote all the words. What words? We just read, we could have read them right from Exodus 20 right through chapter 24. And it says in chapter 24, verse 7, he took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said, we will do and be obedient. Now, the fact is, as you go on reading through the Old Testament, you find an enormous amount of law that is not contained in the Book of the Covenant. The Book of the Covenant is what you read from chapter 20 all the way through chapter 24. And many have said in reading this that what they presume by this is that these are the laws that they needed where they were, that they needed now. There actually were, as they came out of Egypt, there were slaves among them. As they continued on up and down the land, there were questions of boundaries. When they entered into the camp, there was questions of property. There were questions of, all kinds of relationship questions as they passed through the wilderness. And that many of these laws were possibly anticipating being in the land, but they were the most needed laws for the time and for the place. And we will find, as we make our way on down through the other books of the law, as we read through them, we find that there are additional problems that arise, and then answers are given to those problems. There are revelations of additional laws which weren't mentioned in the original book of the covenant. But this is what is called the book of the covenant. Now, as we go on from this, it also becomes a little bit of a surprise that nothing has been put in stone yet. There's a tendency to think that the place where the Ten Commandments were written in stone with the finger of God was in Exodus 20. No, that's when God spoke them from the mountain and they heard His voice. That's when the book of the law was given to Moses verbally. Moses wrote it all down. This is not the oral law. The oral law was not given to Moses on this occasion, because everything God told him, he wrote down and became a part of the written law. But it does come as a surprise that nothing is written in stone. That comes later. And then when it is written in stone, we are introduced to a new concept, an important concept. And it's funny, I don't hear people talk about this very much. I think it's very important. Now, in Exodus 25, you have the instructions that are given to prepare the tabernacle, followed by instructions for making the ark. The ark is a box. It's 1 unit wide, 2 units long, and 1 unit high. It's that kind of a shape, a rectangular box. And it had a lid on it called Kippur, or Kippur, from which we get the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the Day of the Covering. And it is just a cover. It's translated, for some strange reason, in the Bible, mercy seat. I presume because that's where God appears, between the cherubim upon the top of the ark. But it isn't a mercy seat. It's merely the cover of the ark. So, the instructions are given on all these, and then Moses says this, in verse 16, "You shall put into the ark the testimony which I will give you." Now, what he seems to be saying here is that there's something coming that he has not given him yet. Whatever it is that he has not given him yet is called the testimony. Note that it is to come even though the book of the covenant, which includes 10 commandments, has been written down. Exodus 25, verse 21. "You shall put the cover above upon the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I shall give you. And I will there meet with you, and I will commune with you from above the mercy seat, and between the 2 cherubims which are upon the ark of the testimony, of all the things that I will give you in commandment to the children of Israel." Now, you notice anything odd in that verse? He doesn't call it the ark of the covenant, does he? He calls it the ark of the testimony. It's a particular term. It's a very important term. In Exodus 26, verse 33, "You shall hang up the veil under the taches, that you may bring in there the ark, behind the veil, the ark of the testimony." Now, if I stop just for a moment, what the tabernacle was like, it was a rectangular room, 1 unit wide, 2 units long, divided in the middle so that you have on the outside the holy place, on the inside the Holy of Holies, and hanging between the two is a veil. The veil, and behind the veil in the Holy of Holies is the Ark of the Covenant. Or, as we're finding here, no, not the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Testimony. So it is placed, as it says here, behind that veil. "The veil shall divide unto you between the holy place and the most holy, and you shall put the cover upon the ark of the testimony in the most holy place." Now, what is interesting about this is that the biblical descriptor, that is the biblical term for the 10 commandments, I think all of you by now probably know this, that the words 10 commandments are not what you find in the Old Testament. It's the 10 words, not the 10 commandments. But the descriptor for it is the testimony. What we call the 10 commandments, the book of Exodus calls the testimony of God. The ark was originally called, not the Ark of the Covenant, it was called the Ark of the Testimony. Why was it called the Ark of the Testimony? Because the testimony of God was in it. You placed the 2 tablets of stone inside there, put the lid on the ark, put it in the holy place, drew the veil, and it became the place of the testimony. Now here's a question you have to ask at this point. The Ten Commandments are not merely a set of laws. They are the testimony of God. Is the testimony of God true or false? Because in the Bible, when one gives testimony, you are bearing witness of the truth. And what God does when He gives Israel His testimony, this is His testimony of the truth. So that the Ten Commandments are fact. They are truth. They are the testimony of God. Now the reason this is important is because of what I consider basically a frivolous argument, a facile argument, it's a very popular argument, that the Ten Commandments are the Old Covenant. That they actually tie them up in a knot together, bind them together, and then they say that the passing of the Old Covenant means that the Ten Commandments pass away along with the Old Covenant. But the thing is, we find initially that the Ten Commandments are not the covenant. We find that initially that the Ten Commandments are the testimony of God that are placed in the Ark of the Testimony and placed in the middle of the tabernacle, which is called, believe it or not, the Tabernacle of the Testimony in one place. Why would it be called the Tabernacle of the Testimony? Because that's where the testimony of God is. The absolute centerpiece of the tabernacle was not the ark. It was the testimony that was inside the ark. All the ark was a box that carried the testimony of God. Now it's fascinating, you see Raiders of the Lost Ark, you see all the articles and movies and documentaries about the ark, and it's the ark, and how important is the ark. But the ark is nothing but a box. What's inside the box is the testimony of God, and that's what's important. That's what's powerful. Okay, now the good question is, does the violation of the Old Covenant by Israel make God's testimony any less true? Would it invalidate God's testimony? Well, of course not. Now, notice the usage. And usage is important. In other words, when you're reading an old document like this, when you want to know what they mean by what they say. And it's in the usage of terms that you begin to pick up on meanings and you can begin to clarify your definitions. In Exodus 27, chapter 27 of Exodus, verse 19, we're in a description of the tabernacle. And he says, all the vessels of the tabernacle, in all the service thereof, and all the pins and the pins of the court, are all be made out of brass. And you shall command the children of Israel that they bring unto you pure oil olive, beaten for the light, to cause the lamp to burn all the time. In the tabernacle of the congregation without the veil which is before the testimony. Notice, in the tent of meeting, just outside of the veil, in front of the veil, which is before the testimony. The veil, which is what is just before the testimony. So you have the ark with the testimony of God, and so it says before the testimony, you have the veil. Just outside of that, you put this lamp. And Aaron and his sons shall order it from even to even before the Lord. It should be a statute forever in their generations on the behalf of the children of Israel. They're supposed to keep this thing burning all the time, just outside the veil, which is just before the testimony. Just that one word, the testimony. And the reader is expected to know what he's talking about. The two tables of stone that are inside the ark, and upon which two tables of stone are written the testimony of God. Pass on down to Exodus chapter 30. He says, you shall make an altar to burn incense on. Of acacia wood shall you make it. A cubit is the length, a cubit the breadth, 4 square shall it be. 2 cubits of the height, and the horns shall be the same. And you were to overlay it with pure gold, the top, the sides round about thereof, and the horns. You shall make unto it a crown of gold all the way around. You put 2 golden rings on it to make unto the crown by the 2 corners. The 2 sides of it shall you make it. They shall be for places for the staves to carry it. You shall make the staves of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. And you shall put it, that's this little altar, it's an incense altar. You shall put it right in front of the veil that is by the ark of the testimony. Now, it's going to become apparent to you, and you can do your own Bible study on this. You might enjoy it, as a matter of fact, to dry your concordance out. Look up all the uses of the word testimony in the Old Testament and see how the term is used. In its context, you're going to see that almost invariably it is talking about the testimony of God, the two tables of stone, what we call the Ten Commandments, which are in the Ark of the Testimony. And the Ark of the Testimony is in its earliest days, all through Exodus, and sometimes in Numbers and all the way down to Joshua, is oftentimes called the Ark of the Testimony, not the Ark of the Covenant. It is mainly in Deuteronomy, but somewhat, I think, I'm not sure about Leviticus, and somewhat in Numbers, that it is called the Ark of the Covenant. But the oldest name and the dominant name is the Ark of the Testimony. Why? Because it contained the testimony of God. He says, I will meet with you there. Aaron shall burn sweet incense on it every morning when he dresses the lamps. He shall burn incense upon it. And when Aaron lights the lamps at even, he shall burn incense on it. A perpetual incense before the Lord throughout all your generations. You just continue as you read through Exodus to get this dominant feeling that the testimony of God is the centerpiece of the tabernacle. Everything in it focuses on that. That, the ark which contains it, the veil which is in front of it, everything focuses on that place. Later in Exodus 30, verse 26, he says, you shall anoint the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle of the congregation, and the ark of the testimony. Then in chapter 31, God gave unto Moses, verse 18, God gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, tables of stone, written with the finger of God. Now, if you know anything about law at all, you know that a handwritten document is very important. That not merely your signature is upon a typewritten document, but when you've actually written the thing out in your own handwriting and signed it, you have, this is a very legal, a very binding thing. Well, what we're dealing with here is, first of all, God speaks a set of laws to Moses, which Moses writes down, and they're called the Book of the Covenant. Now we're dealing with something which is not the tables of the covenant initially. What they are initially are the tables of the testimony of God, written with his own finger. So Moses wrote the Book of the Covenant. The testimony of God is a handwritten document with God's own finger on tables of stone. So, in Exodus 32, verse 15, Moses turned and went down the mount, and the 2 tables of the testimony were in his hands. The tables were written on both their sides. On one side and on the other were they written. So, what are the 10 Commandments? They are the testimony of God. Now passing on down to Exodus chapter 38. This is the sum of the tabernacle, even of the tabernacle of testimony, as it was accounted according to the commandment of Moses for the service of the Levites and of Ithamar, son to Aaron the priest. Note, even the tabernacle is called the tabernacle of testimony. The testimony is the centerpiece of the tabernacle. Still later in Exodus chapter 40, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying this, on the first day of the month you shall set up the tabernacle and the tent of the congregation, and you shall put therein the ark of the testimony. And you cover the ark with the veil. You shall bring in the table and set in order all the things that will be set in order. This is the final completion of the tabernacle. We're putting the stuff in the tabernacle. All the things are to be set in order upon it. You shall bring in the candlestick, light the lamps. You shall set the altar of gold for the incense before the ark of the testimony, and then put up the hanging of the door to the tabernacle. And you shall set the altar of the burnt offering before the door of the tabernacle, the tent of the congregation. Verse 19. So Moses spread abroad the tent over the tabernacle. He put the covering of the tent upon it as the Lord commanded Moses. And he took and he put the testimony into the ark. What did Moses put in the ark? 2 tables of stone with the 10 Commandments on them, which gives you an idea of what the size of these tables of stone are, because we know what the ark was 1 cubit by 1 cubit by 2 cubits, and so you have a box that size that they had to go into. They weren't that large. They could be carried by Moses. They were stone. They could be carried with him down the mountainside. So he put the testimony into the ark and set the staves on the ark and put the cover above the ark. And he brought the ark into the tabernacle. He set up the veil of the covering and covered the ark of the testimony as the Lord commanded Moses. Note, not the Ark of the Covenant, although it became to be called so, but it's the Ark of the Testimony. there is this strong, repetitive emphasis on the testimony of God, the ark of the testimony, the tabernacle of the testimony, and the emphasis that is made that way. Now, the term, the ark of the covenant, will come into later use. But all the way down to the book of Joshua, you find this in Joshua 4 and verse 16. Command the priests that bear the ark of the testimony that they come out of Jordan. In other words, he had them carry the ark into Jordan and stand there, and the river stopped, and they all crossed. Then he calls them to come back out of there. What is it they call it? The ark of the testimony. Now, down through Israel, the testimony had a peculiar and a special identity. And the funny thing is, if you read your Bible without necessarily making the ancient connection, there are quite a few things that you will read that will go in one ear and out the other and may not register. For example, in 2 Kings, chapter 11, verse 9, you've got a major political coup in the making in Israel. And the captains of the hundreds have done everything according to what Jehoiada the priest. They're going to make a man king. They took every man of his men that were coming on the Sabbath, with them that should go out on the Sabbath, and came to Jehoiada the priest. And to the captains over hundreds did the priests give King David spears and shields that were in the temple of God. They armed all of them. And the armed guard stood, every man with his weapons in his hand, round about the king, from the right corner of the temple to the left corner of the temple, along by the altar and the temple. And he brought forth the king's son. He put the crown upon him and gave him the testimony. Now, I don't know what he did here. Whether or not this is a copy of the testimony that he put in the king's hands as a symbolic thing that this is the law by which this king will rule, or whether somebody had gone into the tabernacle and taken the tables of stone out of the ark, which is really kind of doubtful to me that they would have done that. That would have been a very dangerous thing for them to do, realizing in Israel's history that just putting up your hand to steady the ark caused somebody to die. And on another occasion, a bunch of people got killed because they merely looked into the ark. So doesn't seem very likely. But when they say they put in his hand the testimony, they are specifically talking about the testimony of God, which you and I call the Ten Commandments, in one form or another. The usage was still there. One of the places that you find it so common also is in the Psalms, like Psalm 19:7. I'm going to read several Psalms for you. You may not want to turn to them all. But it says, the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. Now, I think a lot of people who read the Psalms, it never dawns on them that this is a very specific term. The testimony of God is talking about those tables of stone that were put in the ark, which had the Ten Commandments on them, the 10 words of God that tells man what the difference between right and wrong and how to live his life. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony is sure, making wise the simple. Then Psalm 78, verse 1. In Mashil of Asaph, give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have taught us. We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works he has done. For he established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children. Notice, he established a testimony, that simple core document, written in stone, with 10 words that outline conduct for man, the love of man and the love of God. Psalm 81, verse 1. To the musician upon Gittith, the psalm of Asaph. Sing aloud to the God our strength. Make a joyful noise to the God of Jacob. Take a psalm and bring hither the timbrel, the pleasant harp, and the psaltery. Blow the trumpet in the new moon in the time appointed on a solemn feast day. For this was a statute for Israel, and a law for the God of Jacob. This he ordained in Joseph for a testimony. He even seems to say that these later laws, like those laws having to do with the Ten Commandments, with the holy days, are part of God's testimony to Israel. And he went through the land of Egypt, where I heard a language I didn't understand. Psalm 119, 88. Quicken me after your loving kindness, so shall I keep the testimony of your mouth. What God has testified to us. Psalm 122, verse 1. A song of degrees of David. I was glad when they said to me, let's go to the house of the Lord. Our feet shall stand within your gates. O Jerusalem. Jerusalem is built like a city that is compact together. Whether the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, unto the testimony of Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. Now think about that, what he's just said. He is talking about a time, the gates of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a city that is built compact together. It's the place where all the tribes go up to the testimony of Israel. Not to the temple, not just to the ark. They go up there to the testimony. That's where the testimony of God was. Where was it? It was inside the ark, behind the veil, by this time, this was written apparently in the temple. Then there's this little short passage in Isaiah, the 8th chapter, which I find particularly interesting in this. Isaiah 8 and verse 16. He says, bind up the testimony. Seal the law among my disciples. And I will wait upon the Lord that hides his face from the house of Jacob, and I will look for him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are for signs and wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells upon Mount Zion. Isaiah is speaking, and if you read the story coming up to this, he has had children which actually serve as examples and illustrations of prophecies which are going to be coming to pass. That's why he says, I and the children that God has given me are for signs to Israel. And when they shall say to you, seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and to wizards that peep and that mutter. Should not a people seek to their God? Should the living seek to the dead? No. Where should they look? To the law and to the testimony. If they speak not according to this, there is no light in them. Now think about that. Again and again and again we are referred to the testimony of God. That the core, the Constitution of Israel, the foundational documents upon which everything they ever had in terms of law were built, was the testimony of God. The testimony of God is the testimony as to the facts, the truth. And God's testimony is always true and never false. Now, later in Deuteronomy, and here's where some of the people go to make their point. In Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 9, this is Moses' final speech to Israel. He says, when I was gone up into the mount to receive the tables of stone, even the tables of the covenant which the Lord made with you, then I abode in the mount for 40 days and 40 nights, and I didn't eat any bread or drink any water during that period of time. Now, here they are called the tables of the covenant. Most firmly, though, they have been called all the way through Exodus and everywhere else, the tables of the testimony of God. What do I conclude from this? Well, I conclude first that the testimony of God was included in the words God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, the words that Moses wrote in the book of the covenant. Remember? He stood on Mount Sinai, he spoke the words, all the 10 commandments, right? Then later, they went up the mountain and God wrote the 10 commandments on tables of stone and calls them the testimony of God. So what I conclude from that is that the testimony of God, which he included in that covenant, existed and had a separate existence from the covenant of that time. The testimony of God has a separate identity all its own. We know that it was in existence long before Israel ever got to Mount Sinai. We know it was in existence from the creation until Mount Sinai. We know it was incorporated into the deal with Israel, and that in no way compromises its separate identity as the testimony of God. It's the truth. God's word is true. And the violation or the collapse of the deal that God made with Israel because of their faithlessness does not make God's testimony any less the truth. John the Baptist speaks in John chapter 3 and verse 31. He that comes from above is above all. He that is of the earth is earthly and speaks of the earth. He that comes from heaven is above all. And we have seen and heard that he testifies, and no man receives his testimony. Now here is the one who actually gave Israel his testimony on Mount Sinai. Here he is again testifying, and people will no longer, this time either, will listen to his testimony. For he that has received his testimony has set to his seal that God is true. Now, why would we assume that this testimony is something different from the testimony that was put on 2 tables of stone, and they were placed in the ark of the testimony, which was placed behind the veil in the tabernacle of testimony, and was the testimony to which Israel repaired every year in their pilgrimages. I don't think we really can do that. He that receives his testimony has this seal that God is true. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God. That's Jesus. Because God has not sent and given the Spirit by measure unto him. Now, a couple more scriptures. Revelation 12 and verse 17. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, this is prophetic, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. The testimony of Jesus Christ. What's that? Why would I assume that it's anything different from what it has always been? It is the truth about the way things are in this world. You know, all the teachings of Jesus find their way back ultimately to 2 tables of stone. Because upon these 2 tables of stone are the testimony of God. Jesus' testimony as well. And it's the testimony upon which every ethical, every moral principle that has ever been given to man are built and founded. Finally, in Revelation 11:19, and the temple of God was open in heaven, looking out way out into the future in prophecy. The temple of God was open in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament. And there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and great hail. You know, it's funny to me that while there was a word that maybe they could have used at this point to say the Ark of the Covenant, he switched over to the Ark of his Testament because of the closeness to the idea of testimony. That what we see in heaven is the Ark. Now, you remember we saw earlier in another Bible study that Moses was told very carefully to make everything according to the pattern that I showed you in the mountain. Because the things that he showed him in those patterns are heavenly things. Is there a tabernacle in heaven? Yeah, apparently so. Is there a candlestick in that? Apparently so. Is there a table? Yes, apparently so. Is there an altar of incense? I gather there is, because Moses was shown the pattern of all these things and said, put them in there. Now we find that in the temple, in heaven, there is an ark. What's inside the ark in heaven? Well, the Bible tells us, Old Testament, that there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tables of stone, Aaron's rod that budded, and a pot of manna. Nothing else. And so I would conclude that whenever that temple of God in the future is open in heaven and the ark is seen, that the cover can be taken off of that ark, and on the inside is the testimony of God, which is true, always has been, and always will be. We'll talk again on this subject.